Welcome back to Africa Science Focus, the weekly science and development show from SciDevNet. I'm Ogechi Ekeanyanwu. On this week's episode of our Science Explained series, we try to understand the concept of mini-grids, a potential solution to Nigerians' long-standing electricity challenges. But first, what is a mini-grid? The United Nations Industrial Development Organization defines a mini-grid as a set of small-scale electricity generators interconnected to a distribution network that supplies electricity to a small, localized group of customers. It usually operates independently from the national transmission grid. The benefits of mini-grids go beyond simply providing electricity. They offer a more affordable and sustainable option compared to diesel generators, a common but expensive and polluting solution in off-grid communities. But how accessible are mini-grids, especially in Nigeria, where, according to a World Bank report in February 2024, over 85 million people, more than 4 out of 10 Nigerians, are deprived of electricity? In this episode, Africa Science Focus editors Ogechi Ekeanyanwu and Titilope Fadare spoke to researchers Temilade Sesan and Ewah Ileri, who explored the connection between mini-grid market regulation and energy access expansion in Nigeria. Ewah Ileri is the executive director of Nigerian-based think tank International Center for Energy, Environment and Development. He lets us know how mini-grids operate.
Mini-grids are situated between what used to be conventional means of extending electricity, which is grid-connected electricity, the ones that we all know very well, that comes from the central electricity grid system to our homes. Between that and the off-grid, which is the isolated, for instance, what has become very popular in Nigeria, solar home systems and so on. So they are meant to sit in between, where governments or communities provide electricity supply for a particular community, which means that you set up generation either using renewable energy like solar, or as we did in Nigeria many years ago, using diesel generators for isolated fire-off communities, and therefore set up a grid system whereby we connected households and production units.
We're now going over to Dr. Temilade Sesan, who researches energy for sustainable development, to understand how serious the power supply problem is in Nigeria.
That's the issue. So Nigeria already has, like, the as you say in our paper, the least reliable electricity supply on the continent. So as I said earlier, that we did a study across 4 countries. Even among those 4 countries, Nigeria has the most abysmal performance, not just in terms of the absolute quantities, but relative to the population. Remember that Nigeria is what we call the giant of Africa. So we have, for example, by comparison, Kenya, maybe maximum they're like about a quarter of our population, but even in terms of, even at that, they have about over 70% coverage, electricity coverage, close to 80. Whereas here, with over 200 million people, we only have about 60% coverage, and it's far less in the rural areas that are being targeted. So we need to look at the context and say this is a huge, huge gap. What role, if we're looking at universal access by 2030, what role can mini-grids? And then we'll also go on to ask provocatively in the policy implications section to say that what role can mini-grids play in concert, right, with other options? If the goal is universal electrification, if the goal is to leave no one behind, how can we be more creative in ensuring that we reach this goal by all the means available to us?
To achieve universal energy access, Nigeria needs a more nuanced approach to electricity sector reform, acknowledging its geographical, political, and social context. Ileri explains why the power supply in Nigeria remains so problematic over the years.
The problems associated with expanding electricity access is not unconnected with the lack of progress that we have made in expanding available grid electricity over the years. The government in Nigeria, since the year 1999 to 2000, had singled out the electricity sector as a major area of investment, as a pivotal infrastructure area. And unfortunately, the available power we are generating and transmitting and the capacity to distribute them have not grown according to the scale or the ambition of the government, to say the least, over the years. And therefore, when the available electricity has not grown significantly, we also expect that it will affect other means of delivering electricity services. So that the challenge is not unconnected with the development in the broader electricity system. For mini grids, my take on why it has been a bit difficult to make progress here, but on the broader context, mini grids came at a time where there is an ideological change, an ideological shift in how we deliver electricity. In the 80s, 40 years ago, government has assumed an important role of planning the delivery of electricity services to all parts of Nigeria, including rural areas. And therefore, there was significant investment, significant budget lines in all the budgets at both at the federal and state level in expanding electricity. Now comes the past few decades where there is reforms in the electricity sector. And it wasn't only in Nigeria. This is something that the World Bank and the Washington Consensus agreed on, that these reforms have to happen in most countries. And unfortunately, part of the collateral damage of that reform is that government lost interest, or government's role became very reduced in financing electricity assets expansion. And what we had left are private sector solutions or hybrid forms of that. So the lifeblood of expanding assets is actually financing. And when you withdraw a key role player in financing electricity assets expansion, then you can begin to find the root causes of the challenges we face. So now what we have are trickles of funding that comes from international development assistance, going primarily to off-grid and mini-grids. And I think that shift in paradigm between public led or state-led solutions to private sector-led solutions, it is in that nexus that we can find most of the challenges that we have in delivering electricity in general to unserved communities.
As Nigeria targets universal energy access by 2030, mini-grids can help bridge the energy access gap. However, the deployment of mini-grids pose significant governance, regulatory, and socio-economic challenges. Dr. Sesan provides insight into how Nigeria can adopt mini-grids to help it meet its target to achieve universal access by 2030.
The situation we find ourselves now is linked totally to the failures of what we call the NESI, the Nigerian electricity supply industry. The pseudo privatization that left discos, almost insolvent, and with very low institutional, financial, technical capacity to deliver. This caused by the founding EPS area, that's the Electric Power Sector Reform Act of 2005, were supposed to be the de facto last mile distributors to everywhere, like including potentially rural areas. But discos don't have the capacity now, almost like 2 decades later. And so it is these gaps that are showing. And rather than address or approach these issues holistically, it seems like mini grids, again, whether intentionally or not, have now been, they're now being seen like as a quick fix to issues that are more fundamental to the sector. Yes, some funding came in from, development finance institutions that are keen on the decarbonization agenda. No problem with that. But how does it fit into our own broader national priorities and strategies? The financing that we have, again, that Ewah touched on from these DFIs is actually debt. They're not grants. They're given out as grants to private sector developers, but it's debt. It's debt that your children and my children are expected to pay back, in the future. And so it makes it all the more imperative that this investment actually delivers the intended output. But nobody is really looking at that in a very holistic manner. And back to your core point about equity, which we try to, it's the core of the paper to say that, again, these mitigating interventions, they have delivered something. Okay, that's not to say they have done nothing. However, I think our research shows that the key thing is we need to be questioning whether, and there's some evidence pointing to this, that this whole sort of market regulatory arrangement has the tendency, it looks like it might be reproducing inequalities, right? Existing inequalities. So, for example, just as so sort of we try to break it down, to the extent that these things have worked for people in rural areas, it tends to displace, right, power supply that was previously provided by diesel and petrol, right? So businesses, for example, small and medium enterprises, say cold rooms or guest houses or something in rural areas that used to use diesel, are now the ones benefiting the most from mini grids. So the tariffs, even though they're high in absolute terms, relative to how much they were spending on diesel and petrol, is lower. That's not a bad thing, right? But maybe in many ways, the more urgent need would be to spur new demand, by increasing productivity in the rural areas. That's the whole point of this drive. You don't have people who couldn't afford electricity before, or alternatives. You don't have them now being moved en masse to mini grids. So it's like reproducing the existing divide between who had power, yes, from fossil fuels and from from temporary sources, generators, but people who had power before and people before and after, there's almost no difference between those who have access to the power. And that's the key thing. It's the reality that we now have to face. How do we then bring in, and this is the inclusiveness in the Sigma objectives. How do we bring in people who have been excluded historically, such that we leave no one behind, as the SDGs say? It's an there's a big affordability issue with the mini grids that we have now. And it's interesting because institutionally, it's like no one wants to touch the poor, right? So you have, from our research, you have the discourse saying essentially they won't go, they won't go near rural areas with a pole because they can't pay. The government is, essentially offloading that responsibility that Ewah was talking about of making public finance available for rural education, essentially ceding it to the private sector and to DFIs. The private sector actors, if there are any heroes in this story, would be them, because they are trying to basically make things work where it's really difficult. But they don't have as much capacity as they are not as capitalized, for example, as even discos that have all these problems. So currently, the system is not to the benefit of the poorest, who would really who really need electricity to be extended to them.
Ileri shares insights on decentralized grid systems within the context of the limited mini-grid connections in Nigeria.
It is our national goal to reach universal access. And as a country, we keep setting national targets. So actually today, in many documents, our target is to reach universal access to electricity services by 2030. And so governments assign roles for grid connected electricity, mini grids, and stand-alone systems or off-grid energy services. So mini grids would be significant, or its contribution will be significant, if it provides a sizable share of those connections, of providing access to the population. Now we have recent estimates. We have nearly 100 million Nigerians who are not connected to electricity services. And that's over 30 million households, for instance, who are not connected to electricity services. And just from that deductions, because of the size of the number of households that are not connected and the growth in the number of households that we have every year as a result of population increases, we should be doing at least 1 million new connections to electricity every year to be able to just close the gap that we have until the year 2030. So if we are doing well at all, we should, as a country, be delivering access up to at least 1 million new households every year. So where does mini grid stand here? And I think that is where we need to situate the question. How many households do we currently connect using mini grids? And how do we compare it to standalone systems and grid-connected electricity? So that is the crux of the matter. And our study clearly states that the scope of that challenge that mini grids meet is almost insignificant. If you put together all the installed mini grids in our country, that the total amount, the total number of connections that presently exists, it's so low compared to that scope of the challenge of closing that gap. So in that way, and that is really one of the essence of our study, to see how mini grids can be more effective, how it could play a bigger role in providing electricity access.
So what can be done to get mini grids to play a bigger role in electricity access? And how can the government and the private sector increase electricity access in rural areas?
I really think that we need to rethink the so-called political economy of how we expand electricity services. Because come to think of it, most of us who live in urban areas, we rent an apartment or buy a home in areas where there is already cables of electricity connecting our households. So what we do is that when we move into a new place, we pay monthly charges as we consume electricity. The inequality that Temilade talks about there is that if you don't live in those areas and you are poor, you are asked to pay the capital costs of generating, transmitting, and distributing electricity all in one. And that is essentially where the inequality lies in the private sector solutions to electricity access. And if we take a step back, in most of the countries that have successfully expanded electricity services to remote areas, both in developed and developing countries, they have been done by public sector investments. There are very few exceptions to this rule. There are very few countries that you can point to in the literature where universal access has been reached by private sector investments in the main. So we need to resituate this discussion about electricity being important for the overall development of the rural areas and areas that are not being reached, to see how government and the private sector can work more effectively to expand access, because we have seen over the past few decades that progress has been very slow using this new paradigm of exclusively private sector investments. So I think we need to, the electricity sector should not just be seen as a technical an investment area. We should also be seen as a governance area, that the way we see the delivery of roads, that essentially you don't tell a community to pay the total cost of building a road before they can use it. It is when the road is built that you can now set up toll gates or taxes to pay back the cost of the roads. So what we're asking the poor to do is essentially to build a road themselves before they can use it. And that is where the inequality lies in that. So I think there's that we should look at the politics, not only the policies, but the politics behind the delivery of energy services. And this is, you can see that clearly in the results that you're getting from the delivery of mini grids.
Dr. Sesan suggests linking agriculture to electricity input to improve energy access in remote areas. How can this be done? Let's find out from her.
So the whole point of this is to basically critically look at what's working and what's not. As I said earlier, there are things that this mini grid regime has achieved, but it's important to be honest about what it has and maybe can achieve and what it can't, at least not on its own. And this is where, the whole governance approach and looking at politics and all of that, mini grids actually should be seen as from a political economy, from a politics, and also from a development perspective. Okay, so currently we're talking about how the Nigerian economy as a whole needs to be kick-started to check, all of the rising inflation and the currency breakdown and all of that. A key part of what are the sectors that need to be revitalized? A key one is agriculture. Where does agriculture reside? It's in the rural areas. Is there an opportunity? We think there is. We know there is. We have another paper coming out in this regard to link agriculture to to electricity inputs so that productivity can be increased in these rural areas in this sector. And so the sort of cycle of affordability and electricity use can be strengthened. Okay, so we're looking, that's a more like medium to long-term thing in terms of when the outcomes will be evident. But it does require for the government to start making inputs now. So as Ewah said, don't just see it as a technical issue. Let's look at how we can link it to our national development objectives and where public financing needs to come in for agriculture, for energy, for all these inputs sort of are coordinated and, it's part of an overall strategy, an overall development strategy. I think that's one major way by which we can, make strides and make rural areas more viable, because we're not content with saying, poor rural areas cannot afford these things. The next step is, okay, how can these things be more affordable to them? So yes, attack it from the supply side, but also demand side as well. There are demand side initiatives that can be, introduced, such as this whole idea of revitalizing rural economies. That would be another part of the equation.
Dr. Sesan shared some more recommendations for equitable electricity access.
So we talk about harmonizing the regulatory environment. And this essentially talks about, what we're saying, you can't, it's difficult to have mini-grids work within the framework of a failed or a failing broader electricity supply industry. So the roles and responsibilities of the different actors, including the discos, their capacities, how can they be strengthened to be able to be more productive, right? Including for rural areas within the because there is no reason, for example, why discos should not be playing within the mini grids field. But one thing hindering them is that they don't have enough technical capacity. So doing that, and just to note that shortly after this paper was published, the Electricity Act was ratified. Electricity Act of, I think it was 2023, just last year was ratified. And so that makes provision for, different states. So it's like further decentralization, okay? It's not specific to mini grids, but this is the kinds of things, all these different regulatory provisions, it needs to be harmonized to make sure that different actors are playing different complementary roles, not overlapping. And at the end of the day, the needs of everybody, including rural areas, are served. And, again, the other provisions feed into this. We need to see mini grids within the broader framework of rural electrification policy. How does it sit within the goal? I think it's about beginning with the end in mind. Seeing mini grids, understanding that they're a means to an end and not the end in themselves is important. And the idea of, I think the third one we say is to institutionalize mechanisms for transparent governance of the sector. That's really key. That's an institutional thing. Recently, and I can say this here, recently we heard about the not so salutary rules from the Rural Education Agency and leading to just not wholesome practices, within the sector. These are things that need to be safeguarded. And basically the money for rural education needs to be ring-fenced because it's a priority. And finally, still speaking of money, because as Ewah said, finance is a key driver. It's not the only thing. In some ways, it may not be the first thing to consider. In some ways, you do have to have institutional capacity first. But finance is a huge, huge part of that.
And that's all from us at Africa Science Focus today. If you want to find out more, head to the SciDevNet website. That's www.scidev.net. Today's show was produced by Alice Hurst with editing and reporting by Ogechi Ekeanyanwu and Titilope Fadare. I'm Ogechi Ekeanyanwu. Until next time, it's goodbye. Africa Science Focus is produced by SciDevNet and distributed in association with your local radio station.